message. There's a message from Carrie Kleba, and it details a couple major categories that we've gotten a lot of questions on. So I'm going to start by going through some things on each of those categories, because I think that will clear up a lot of questions that people have. And then if you have follow-up questions on any of those topics, or if you have questions on other topics as we get going, just go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we will circle through as many of those as we have time to. We set this for an hour. We're doing another one that's starting at 6:30, so we can go a little bit over this hour. We don't need to necessarily stop right at right at 6 p.m., but we would need to stop by about 6:15 so that we can get ready for that next session. But as I said, if you have questions that we don't get to, or if you have specific questions that relate to how things will be handled at your school, our building principals would be very happy to help you out with any of those questions. We are going to talk through where we are with our planning. And many of you probably were watching the school board meeting last week, Monday, and at that meeting, the board approved kind of a skeleton of a plan, and weren't able at that time, and still aren't able to have every I dotted and every T crossed, because part of our planning is going to be around our next step that I'll talk to in just a minute. But since that board meeting, we have been working, now that the board has approved the skeleton of the plan, we have been, as I call it, dotting some of those I's and crossing some of those T's, while still being in communication and getting feedback from our staff members and families about ways that we can best meet everyone's needs. Some of our decisions that we're going to be making coming up are going to be dependent on the information that we get from you. How we set up and how many cohorts we set up is going to depend on how many students are planning to come in on site. So one of the things that we're doing is reaching out and getting that information from you. And you'll see that one of the questions that's coming up that I'll speak to is, can people change back and forth? If now you're leaning toward being on site, but if we get going, or even when we get closer to the start of the school year, you decide that it would be a better fit for your child and your family to be virtual, we will have some options for people to make those changes. And I'll again talk some more about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into that first topic on the list, which is face covering use, and share some overview on that. And I guess one more qualifier before we get started. We know that there are people with a wide range of viewpoints on all of these different things that we're going to be talking about. And it really is one of the most important things that we've done as educators. I've been in education for a long time, and it probably is the biggest issue that I've ever dealt with as an educator, is really balancing the two big guiding principles that we have. And those are to first look for ways to decrease the risk to students and staff in our community as we bring students back, but still provide a high quality education for all of our students. And balancing those two things is really what we're trying to do. We are seeing districts fall on really both ends of that spectrum. Some that have already decided that they're planning to start completely virtual, and other school districts that have decided that they're going to start bringing every student back every day. Our plan, as you know, has some elements of both of those, but also has some options for families. So to get into that topic of face covering use, we are requiring face coverings for all students, staff, and visitors in our buildings. Face coverings aren't restricted to just be masks. They can be a face shield. They could be a bandana, a gaiter that's worn around the neck and then can be pulled up over the nose and mouth. But we are requiring that all students and all staff members have those with them at all times, and they're utilizing them anytime they're in any shared space, like a hallway, on the bus, in the office area, or in a restroom. And also utilizing those in the classrooms when they are not able to have that physical distancing. So we do, though, understand that there will be times when having we're kind of referring to it as a mask recess or a break from wearing that mask is important, especially as we start the school year in September. In some of our buildings, it can get quite warm. So we are using a process where if students are in the classroom, the teacher is in the front of the classroom, everyone has that more than 6 feet of physical distancing apart from each other, and no one is moving around the classroom. People are able to slide their face coverings off until someone is up and moving in the classroom or people are getting within that 6-foot social distance range. I'll speak more specifically to some of the face covering things on some different other areas too, but in general, it's an expectation that everyone has that with them and is utilizing it. It really is a requirement for face coverings. We are following many of the guidelines from Rock County Public Health. We've been in contact with them over the last 4 or 5 months as we've been working through this process, and they've been really helpful in putting together some guidelines that we are following. The face coverings is kind of tied to the physical distancing that I talked about. One key aspect of our plan is to make sure as much as possible we are keeping people both in as small of groups as possible, small cohorts, we call them, and also keeping that physical distancing. One of the things that we've learned from Rock County Public Health is that by doing those two things, along with having the face coverings in place, it greatly decreases both the risk that the transmission will happen. It doesn't eliminate the risk. So we can't promise that if someone is positive with the virus, that it won't be passed to someone else. But the better job that we do in keeping small cohorts, in maintaining the physical distancing and requiring that use of face coverings, the less likely it is that spread will take place. The other piece with the physical distancing is it not only makes for a safer atmosphere, it also decreases the number of people who would be potentially quarantined if there is a positive case. And I want to talk to that a little bit, and that's in our discussions with Rock County Public Health. And I know different counties have different models for that, but in our discussions with Rock County Public Health, they have reinforced that if there is a positive case, they will notify us if someone tests positive. We may also hear it already from the person who tests positive, but we will definitely be contacted right away by Rock County Public Health. And then we will work with them to identify who has been in close contact with that individual that tested positive, whether that individual is a student, a staff member, a visitor to the schools, whoever that is. And what they've shared with us is the guideline that they have in place is that anyone within the 48 hours before symptoms developed for that person who tested positive, anyone who was in close clinical contact with them during that time would likely be quarantined. But they have a pretty defined guideline on what that close clinical contact is for someone who tests positive. It's someone that either had physical contact with that person, so it could be a hug or a handshake or a high five. So we are limiting those types of things, but also someone that was within 6 feet of them indoors for 15 or more minutes at a time. So just being in the same school building doesn't mean that you would be quarantined or your child would be quarantined if someone tests positive. And even being in the same classroom doesn't necessarily mean that someone would be quarantined if someone tests positive. It really is around that increased likelihood of the spread of the virus if you're inside of someone, inside that 6-foot circle for 15 or more minutes. So that's why that physical distancing is vital for us. Screening, I want to talk a little bit about screening. We will require that all of our staff members and all of our students are screened before coming into any of our buildings. And for students, that means that we're going to ask parents to self-screen students before they put them on the bus or before they bring them to school. What we're using for our summer staff is a temperature of 100.4 degrees, a temperature of 100.4 degrees or higher, and one or more of the symptoms for COVID-19. And we have those symptoms listed on our website. We will be sending more information out to families about what that screening process looks like. But our expectation is before any staff come into any of our buildings, they've gone through the screening process, which involves taking their own temperature, asking themselves a couple screening questions about whether they have any of those specific symptoms and whether they've come in contact with someone who tested positive or who has had those symptoms. And if they don't pass that screening, then they're required to stay home either for that day or for an extended period of time, depending on what their symptoms are. And we would have that same thing in place for students. We would expect parents, before they send their students to school, to take their child's temperature, to ask those screening questions or to monitor those screening questions. And then if the student doesn't pass that screening, it's really important that we aren't having students that are exhibiting symptoms coming into school, because we want to be able to be open for students. We want to be able to stay open for students. And if we start having to have outbreaks, it is more and more likely that we would have to go back to a completely virtual model. And we would prefer to avoid that if at all possible. So that's an expectation that we'll have for parents. We realize that sometimes a child might be healthy when they leave for school in the morning, even not related to COVID-19. But even during the season, a student might be healthy when they come to school and then start to not feel well during the school day. We will still monitor those symptoms at school. And if a student is showing signs of being ill at school, we'll contact parents. And if we aren't able to get in contact with parents, we'll need an emergency contact or someone that will be able to come and pick that child up at school to decrease the chances that anything that they have could be spread to others. The next item on the list is a response to symptoms and a positive test. I talked a little bit about that already, but the big message with that I want to share is our partners at Rock County Public Health are putting out some guidelines on this, and they're going to have those out by the end of this week. So we are waiting to get specific language on this out to families and out to staff until we've gotten that guidance from public health. So our plan is to get that guidance from them whenever they have it. They did say that they are trying to get it out to all schools in the county by the end of this week, and then put together our plan for how we will handle someone who has symptoms or who has a positive test based on the recommendations that they share with us. But in general, what we've heard from them over the last few weeks is that protocol that I just described about someone being in that close clinical contact with someone. So just to generalize that, it wouldn't be a case where an entire school would be closed down if there's a positive test, or the whole district would be closed down if there is a positive test. It really would depend on the person who tested positive and the number of contacts that they have had over a period of time before those symptoms developed, because we do know that people can spread the virus without displaying symptoms. So following that guidance from Rock County Public Health, we'll be getting more information out to families probably the early part of next week, when we get that information from them by the end of this week. But we'll be working with them on contact tracing if someone tests positive, identifying anyone who is in that close circle with them. I do want to share with people that we do have a number of activities happening across our district, many of them outdoor activities, some conditioning and things with some of our sports teams. We have some small groups working on band with physical distancing. And we have had a situation with that group where there was a positive test, and we were able to work with Rock County Public Health to trace back who that individual had been in close contact with. And they were really pleased with the process that we put in place for our summer work as far as knowing who everyone has been in contact with and being able to communicate that information out to Rock County. I want to talk a little bit about virtual learning and what that will look like in our elementary schools, and our ability to change back and forth between virtual and on-site. A common question that we've gotten from parents is right now we're leaning in one direction or the other, but what if we change our minds in August, or if we change our minds the first week of school or sometime down the road? And with that question, we're trying to balance a couple different things. We're really making a lot of our plans based on how many people are going to be in, how many students are going to be in our schools, and how many of them are going to be fully remote learning. In part because that allows us to help keep a safe atmosphere for our students and staff. Once we know how many students are planning to come to the schools, then we're able to set our cohorts up and keep them at a size where we're able to have that physical distancing in every classroom and throughout our shared areas at our school as much as possible. So it is important that we have a good idea of how many people are planning to come on site and how many are planning virtual. But I also know that the situation can change both from a societal viewpoint and also from a family viewpoint. And we want to be open to allowing families to have some flexibility to be able to make those changes. On our end, it will be a lot easier for us if a family chooses to be on site and then at some point requests to make a change there and to go virtual. That's a little bit easier switch for us because it doesn't increase the size of our cohorts in our schools. If we have significant number of people who start virtual and want to come back into the schools, that's a little bit trickier for us logistically because that might decrease our ability to have that physical distancing in our cohorts. So in general, what we're looking at as a plan for being able to change back and forth between virtual and on site is that we're going to have a week in mid-August where people will be able to change what they decide this week. So we do want to hear back from everyone at the end of this week, but you won't be tied to what you share with us this week. The reason we want to hear back from you this week again is so that we can start planning how many cohorts we need and get some of that general planning done and plan transportation because we need to know how many people want to send their student on the bus. We will have a window in mid-August where people will be able to switch from on-site to virtual or vice versa if they would like. And we also will look at during the first week of school, we know that some might get into one and realize right away, now that we're seeing this isn't going to work, and we would rather have you switch right away than stay in a system that isn't working for you. So we'll look at during that first week of school, as long as there's space in our classes to be able to do this, to allow families to change during that first week. After the first week, we would really prefer people to stay in the lane that they're in, but we will allow people to apply to switch from on-site to virtual or vice versa. But we would have to look at those on a case-by-case basis to make sure that there is space available for a student to switch and that it meets those types of guidelines. Trying to think if there was anything else. If there are specifics on that you're wondering that I didn't get to in that explanation, add them in the chat box and we'll get to them, or we'll get that answer back to you. Some more details about what virtual learning looks like. We will have specific teachers in our elementary schools through 6th grade who will be doing just virtual teaching. They'll be licensed teachers. They'll be working, planning together with our classroom teachers to develop and kind of mirroring that same guidelines that are and expectations that are coming in the other classes. Virtual learning in our K through 6 classes will be the online portion of that will be 2 to 3 hours per day. And some of that will take place while the actual class is going on. Our teachers will be communicating out to families what those expectations will be. It will be a mix of what's called synchronous learning, which is at the same time as the rest of the class who's on site, and asynchronous, which is learning that takes place with more flexibility at the time. And sometimes we've heard requests from parents for both of those models. Some families prefer that it take place at the same time as the class in session, and others that doesn't work as well for their family schedule. Others would prefer that it take place outside of that. And as we did back in the spring, we'll be working with individual students and individual families if there are problems that develop, because we want to make sure that we're meeting those needs as best we can. Then the cohorts, I talked a little bit already, but at our elementary schools, we want to keep our cohorts to a size that allows us to have that 6 foot or more of physical distancing in every classroom. Our classroom sizes range across our different buildings, so we haven't said that we're going to have 15 students in every class or 12 students in every class. It really is dependent on the size of that classroom and how many student desks we can have in that classroom that still allow more than 6 feet of physical distancing. As a general guideline, we're using about 15 as a general guideline, but it's not going to be the same in classroom to classroom because of those different classroom sizes. An example of what those cohorts will look like, though, if I use an example of, let's say, second grade at Milton West. If we have 3 sections of second grade at Milton West normally, and let's say for this example, we normally would have 20 students in each of those classes, that would be a total of 60 students spread across those 3 classes. We aren't able to separate those 20 students in our classrooms and have them all 6 feet apart. So if we still have that many after families decide whether they're virtual or not, we would split that group up into 4 classes or 4 cohorts rather than 3, have 4 groups of 15 rather than 3 groups of 20 so that we can spread those students out in the classroom. In order to do that, we would utilize our 3 regular second grade teachers for that class, and then we would add a 4th teacher, and that 4th teacher might be, we have licensed teachers who are instructional coaches, are math and reading specialists, they are our specials teachers, and we'll utilize those folks who aren't regular homeroom teachers to take those extra cohorts, and the number of those is going to be dependent on how many extra cohorts we need, and that's going to be dependent on how many families decide to have their children in virtual learning and how many decide to have them on site. But what we will do, because we know that we don't want a situation where someone who's trained to be a music teacher is teaching the core subjects of reading and math to those students. So we would rotate into that cohort that has someone who's not regularly a classroom teacher. We would rotate one of the other cohort teachers into that classroom to teach the math and the reading to that group of students. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, our cohort model. And I'm just going to scroll through the questions on the screen that I'm on and answer some of those. If I get to one that I feel like we've already answered, I might say that we've talked about that already. But if I run into it again later on, I'll speak some more to it. On your questions, try to be as specific as you can to the situation. So I'll read the question and then I'll provide an answer. So is it possible for the schools to do the walk-through temperature scanners on site? The screening question, I shared earlier that we're going to ask parents to screen students before they send them to school. And there's really 2 reasons for that. One is that we don't want a student who's showing symptoms to get on the bus and come to school or to get dropped off at school and be mingling with other students and with staff members before their temperature has been taken and before they've been screened. It's much less risk for students and staff members if that student is screened at home and stays home if they don't pass the screening. So that's one of the reasons, is that safety aspect. The other reason is with the large number of students at each of our elementary schools, and I'll use Northside as an example, realizing that Northside is our largest of the elementary schools, but a similar issue would be in place at the others. We're anticipating that we'll have 600 or more students potentially at Northside every day. And the logistics of taking everyone's temperature, asking them the multiple screening questions around any symptoms that they have, anyone that they've been in contact with, and then any student who doesn't pass that screening, needing to take them to an isolated area for each student and make a contact home and keep that student on site until a parent is able to come and pick them up, isn't practicable as students are showing up at the start of the day. That with 600 students, we would have to have students starting to show up extremely early before the start of the day. Our staff would be tied up screening those students and wouldn't be able to monitor the students that have been screened or would need to be screened. So what we're seeing, not just for us, but for most districts that we've been in contact with, most districts are asking parents to do that screening at home for those two reasons that I just shared. If we have students that come to school that are displaying symptoms, though, we would treat that the same way that we would anytime we have a student who is not healthy at school. Our health service team would work with that student, would take their temperature. If parents did need to be contacted, we would contact them and get parents to come and pick them up as soon as possible. On the next question, is it possible for the schools to do that's the one I just did. How will asymptomatic individuals be handled? Sometimes I'm kind of reading into the question. If I'm not answering what you had intended, if you can ask that, post a question again later on in the chat box. But we know that people can have the virus and spread the virus without showing symptoms. The best way that we can handle that situation is to make sure that people are wearing their face coverings, that we're keeping that physical distance as much as possible, especially when we're indoors, and especially as Rock County recommends, for keeping those interactions that do have to take place to be less than 15 minutes. And we're keeping those cohort groups as small as possible so that if someone does spread the virus, they're spreading it to as few people as possible. And once we know that someone, and I guess the fourth part of that is making sure that if once people are showing symptoms, that they are staying home, whether that's a staff member or a student. A question about what about kids with special needs? How will masks work with kids that have special delays? How will this work with speech therapy? That's another great question. Students that are on an individual education plan or an IEP may have written into their IEP plan that they have some type of an accommodation for wearing a face covering. It may be that they can't wear a mask, but some type of a face shield might be appropriate, or some other type of face covering. It might be that they aren't able to wear any type of covering. That will be determined by the IEP team, which is a combination of teachers and parents and school administrator. So they will work out that individual situation as part of that IEP team. But if that IEP team determines that there's a need for an accommodation, then we would make an accommodation for that student. The next question I see, where will kids who might get sick at school be held? If there's more than one, are they held together? We are required, actually part of the law is that each school has what's called, we'll come up with a different name for it, but the way it was described in the law is an isolation room, where anyone who tests positive goes to wait until they can be transported off site. If it's a staff member, if they leave or if they need a ride, or a student if they're waiting for someone to come and pick them up. We are still working on what the logistics of that will look like. Part of it is going to depend on how many classrooms we need for our different cohorts. So it might be a classroom or two. It might be some office space initially. But that is something that we're still working out. But there is a requirement that each school has a place where anyone who is coming down with symptoms and is at the school where they are isolated until they are able to leave the school. Next question, will the children be able to flip to virtual if isolated? I'm going to kind of explain how I'm understanding that question, that if a student is on site, but they become quarantined or become ill and need to be home, will they be able to take part virtually? I think it only makes sense to allow them to do that. So we will build that into our plan. That's something that came up. Our staff had that same question, and it's something that we're working on, and it makes sense that to avoid falling behind, especially if the student is going to be out for multiple days, that they would be able to switch and start taking part virtually. The next question, visitors, please define who those are. DPI recommends no visitors and holding meetings virtually. We will greatly limit the number of people that are coming into our schools. There will be times when some people will need to, a parent will need to come in to pick up a child if a child is ill. At times, a vendor might need to be in our building if it's a food delivery, some type of a delivery or things like that. But what would normally be kind of the coming and going of people in our school buildings will be greatly curtailed. The reading into that message is that we should limit as much as possible the number of people that are coming into our buildings, and we should be looking to hold our meetings virtually whenever we can, and we definitely would do that. That is something that we think is important. I talked earlier about limiting that circle of people who are coming in contact with others, and I think that's an important part of that. Will you have enough subs to cover for sick teachers? Will they be just Milton subs or potentially bring illness to Milton from another district? When we need substitute teachers, we will require them to screen themselves just like we are with anyone else who's coming into our buildings. We realize that the daily screening doesn't guarantee that no one will be in with the virus, but we will be screening them just like we would normally. We are uncertain on what the sub situation is going to look like in the fall. We have been contacted by a couple people who substitute teach, saying that they're a little bit leery about subbing. So one of the things that we're working with our teaching staff is whether they will have the opportunity, if they are out sick or if they are quarantined, if they'll be able to continue to teach virtually as long as they are healthy enough to do that. And that is a possibility. What we shared with our teachers was that that's something that would be handled on a case-by-case basis, but that might help us with the potential shortage of substitute teachers in the fall. So that's an option that we are exploring. Is there a max cohort number allowed or suggested? The max cohort number is really going to depend on the size of the learning area. What we're saying is that the biggest our cohorts will be a size that allows us to have every desk more than 6 feet apart from every other desk, so that when students are working in their area, no one else is inside that 6-foot bubble with them. In initial looks in our classrooms across the different schools, we have a few places where it looks like 18 desks is manageable in some of our larger classrooms, and in others it will be 15 or smaller in other classrooms. But it's going to be dependent on the size of that learning space. Will there be more buses or shorter routes to decrease the time on the bus and number of students on each bus? That is very likely. we've been working with Go Right Way and working with some other districts across Wisconsin that also utilize Go Right Way. We meet on about a weekly basis with them. And what we're looking at now is a transportation model. And I believe this was sent out to families on Friday in the Red Hawk Review, but a transportation model that would have one family allowed per seat on the bus, and face coverings required on the bus, assigned seats so the same student is sitting in the same seat every day, and buses that are loaded from back to front. So the first students that get on the bus go directly to the back seats, and then they load from the back to the front so that students aren't walking past other students who are already on the bus. When I say one student, one family per seat, in most cases that would be one student, but if we pick up a family that has 2 or 3 students in the same family who are riding that bus, they would be assigned to the same seat so that, because those students are already being in contact with each other regularly. We will monitor the face coverings usage on our buses. Students that don't follow that, we'll be following up with their families. We won't allow students to get on our buses without a face covering in place. Just want to reread that question just to see if there was anything more to that. Will there be more buses or shorter routes? That's going to be dependent on the information that we get from families about how many would prefer to ride the bus. So we'll get that information from you this week. We will run some scenarios on what that will look like. It is extremely likely that we will need to add more routes to our bus routes. And then we'll get back in touch with families about what those routes would look like, the length of time for those routes. We don't want to have to reroute every couple weeks. So it's going to be important that as we get closer and closer to the school year, that we really dial in who's going to be riding on the bus and who's not going to be riding the bus. So we ask you to make your best choice on that right now, with the idea that you're not tied into that moving forward. And to fill out that answer, that was in the Red Hawk Review, those 2 questions that we really want every family to answer. As of right now, if we were starting tomorrow with what you know, would you choose on-site or virtual? And if you choose on-site, would you have your student ride the bus, or would you be providing your own transportation for them? And knowing that you're not tied into either of those choices and that not every piece of information is available, getting that information from you allows us to begin to fill in more of those specific details, and you will have an opportunity to evolve those choices as we move forward. Will there be a dedicated teacher for those kids choosing to learn virtually, 1 to 2 teachers, or will there be teachers rotating throughout the program? And that's a Northside specific question. There will be teachers dedicated for those choosing to learn virtually. The number of teachers is going to depend on how many students choose that option. So we'll be able to hone in on that a little bit better once we know that information. And the last part of that question, or will teachers rotate throughout the program? If I'm understanding that question correctly, the answer would be no. The teacher that's assigned to teach virtually to those students would be a regular licensed teacher, one of our Northside teachers who's assigned that as their duty to teach that cohort online. The next question that I see, what's the plan for recesses, physical activity for the kids during the day? Or is it possible to shorten the school day as it's difficult for students to sit all day or for extended periods of time? The second part of that question is getting at the need for students to get up and moving around. And it's vitally important that students are getting some physical activity. So we will continue to have recess time and phy-ed time throughout the day. We will do that in as physically distant a way as possible. So students will be monitored when they are outside in recess. We'll take them out together with their same cohort, so they aren't intermingling with a different group of students. Let's say there's 15 second graders. that are in a class together, those same 15 students will go outside and do their physical activity together as a group. Sometimes that will be in the field doing some teacher-led activities. Sometimes it will be on the playground. There will be a requirement that if students are inside that 6-foot circle that they keep their face coverings on while they're outside, but anytime they're outside that 6 feet, that's a nice time for them to both get some physical activity in and also get a break from their having their face covering on throughout the day. I see a question that's, if an in-person cohort child is quarantined for 2 weeks, can they switch to virtual for those 2 weeks? I think we answered that yes, we would in every case try to make that happen, and I don't see any reasons that we wouldn't be able to make that happen before returning to in-person after the quarantine is over. Yes, we would. If someone is home, it's better for them to have some instruction than no instruction. So having virtual instruction, even if they're an on-site person, and then when their quarantine is over, being able to circle right back, if their family desires, back on site is how I would see that working. A question, licensed for elementary or for Phi-Ed art? The people that will be teaching our elementary students will be elementary teachers. They will have elementary licensure. And if I'm not understanding that question correctly, we can fill in, you can ask that again later on, or if principals have more information on that, they can get that information out to people too. Can you clarify what virtual learning for 4K looks like? I might have to call on Ms. Cramer to answer that one. Jen, are you able to log in and answer that one?
At this time, we are planning to have 4K virtual. It would be parent-led activities that would be shared on a daily basis, Tuesday through Friday. So if you choose 4K virtual at this time, when we're having both in-person and the virtual option, because 4K is not mandated by the state, and 4K students do not have devices like our kindergarten on up students do. So it will be activities shared on a daily basis that will then be parent-led.
All right. The next question I see, with the virtual plan and specific teachers, how and who will be working with students who have an IEP or 504 plan? How will teachers' IEP be met in the virtual setting? That's going to vary depending on the student's IEP needs. So I'll give a very general answer, and I apologize for the generalness, but the specific details will be worked out by that student's IEP team. So we will be having IEP meetings. We will be able to set those up virtually with families, but the specific details of what the instructional day looks like for those students who are on an IEP or have a 504 plan will be determined by that IEP team. Case managers that normally would be working with that student will still be working with that student and overseeing that student's instruction. I would encourage any specific questions about students with disabilities, if they're on an IEP, or students with a 504 plan, our Special Education Student Services Director, Susan Probst, would be a great resource for specific questions in that area. Can we request to have a traditional teacher and not one of the homeroom teachers that are brought in to fill needs? It will depend on the number of cohorts that we need, but we won't have any classrooms where students won't be getting a high quality education. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be rotating in for our core classes. The reading and math will be rotating in what is referred to in this question, and what I at least assuming is referred to as a traditional teacher. But we won't have the ability for families to choose who their teacher is going to be in that cohort. are students required to provide their own masks? That's a good question. I had meant to speak to that when I was speaking to masks earlier, and I don't think I did. Families are encouraged to have their own face coverings for students, whether it's a mask or a shield or a bandana or a gaiter, but are not required to provide their own. The state of Wisconsin has provided us with a large number of masks. They are kind of cloth masks, strap over your ears, kind of the traditional that we've seen. We do not want to hand those out to families that don't need them or to students who aren't going to use them, but we will have those available for any students who want them. We are looking for more face coverings that are smaller sizes. From what we've seen so far, and we just got these at the end of last week, but from what we've seen so far, the ones that came from the state are all one size and seem to be a better fit maybe for 5th and 6th grade up through 12th grade and might not be as good a fit for younger students. So we will be working on getting some masks available for our younger students or face coverings available for our younger students. I've had a couple of community members reach out to see if we would accept donated masks. So if there are individuals or groups that would like to make some masks and donate them to our schools for us to have available for students, we would happily do that. But in general, on that question, the answer is no, students aren't required to provide their own, but we would strongly recommend that families have a mask or a face covering for their student and that they're getting them used to wearing it now so that they aren't getting used to wearing it when they show up to school. Will teachers leave your district when they find out they are being reassigned? I'm not sure what the reassigned is necessarily referring to, and I don't want to assume, so that might be a question that you can reach out to me or reach out to your building principal with that question, and we will get you an answer to that as best we can. Why not just hire more regular ed teachers for the additional cohorts instead of pulling a specials teacher? Once we get the numbers and know how many cohorts we need, we will look at whether there is a need to hire additional staff or whether we can staff it with our in-house staff. So that's something that is a possibility. But it also is a pretty significant cost. So we want to find out for sure before we commit to hiring any additional teachers. We want to make sure that we know what that need is going to be. We have a question about lunch. How will lunch look this year? Eat in classrooms and cohorts in the lunchroom, hot lunch offered. Lunch is going to be a little bit different in each school depending on the space availability. But in general, we will maintain that physical distancing while we are eating lunch. Our food service staff is working at each school to determine what that will look like. This might be something that we need to get more information out to people on. For today, I can say that we will maintain social distancing as much as possible as students are going down to the lunchroom and getting their meals and getting their meals and eating their meals. We realize that face coverings will have to come off while students are eating their meals, so that makes it even more important that we have that physical distancing. I'm sorry that I chuckled a little bit there. I saw someone on the screen who had a bucket on their head and it made me laugh. Sorry about that. With social distancing on buses, how will this affect the buy-a-seat program? I'll turn, Mrs. Cramer is going to answer that one too. So I'll turn it over to Mrs. Cramer while I recover from the bucket on the head.
Two things I'd like to speak to. One is the buy seat. So the question is, will social distancing on buses, how will this affect the buy seat program? And that is true that might be affected because remember, buy seat program is based on if there is room on the bus. And so now what we have with these new attendance boundaries, we've limited the area that the buses do go. So that is yet to be determined once we figure out the ridership of those buses. So that is something we're going to be keeping an eye on, but it might affect that bi-seat program. So great question. The second thing I just want to offer a little bit of clarification to with the kindergarten through third grade cohort model. And so what we're, as Mr. Dahman had spoke to before, saying that we would be adding an extra section to each of those grade level cohorts. And that's true, but what we're going to is yet to be determined, number one, the numbers, and then number two, whoever that extra person is in that type of model, we'll have to see what their skill set is. So if it's a reading specialist, you know, they obviously have lots of experience in the area of literacy, and we will want to utilize that skill set. However, if it is, let's just say for an example, a art teacher or music teacher, you know, their skill set is different. And so depending on who is part of that model will determine the vehicle we'll use to get the information to the other cohorts, you know. So that's yet to be determined depending on the numbers, but I'm just kind of putting it out there that we have to look at the skill set of the people involved.
Thank you, Mrs. Cramer. And I'll take a moment just to remind people that it's fine if you have your own camera on, but realize that other people can see you when you have your own camera on, but it's okay if you keep it on. The next question, what does lunch and recess look like? I think we answered that already. It's about social distancing while eating. Question about lockers. We will not be using lockers. When the weather gets cold and we start to have jackets and boots and cold weather gear, we will come up with a plan for that. We're not certain that we will be in the same mode when we get to that point. We may be at a place where we are able to use lockers at that point, or have some type of a system where we stagger when students are able to go to their lockers so that they're not standing right next to each other at their lockers. A question about, will tables be utilized at any grade level, or will all classrooms utilize individual desks? Most of our schools and classrooms have tables. I think when we're not in a pandemic situation, I think that's a great way for us to promote collaborative learning for students. It does make it a little bit trickier for us to socially distance students. So that's going to be another question that's going to be answered depending on how large those cohorts end up being. And that's going to be dependent on how many families are on site versus virtual. We will make sure that all students in the classroom are physically distant from each other. So whether they're at a desk or a table, it will be a situation where those students are 6 feet or more from each other in their cohort. To clarify, face shields can be used instead of masks when required. Yes, masks, face shields, bandanas, gaiters are all allowed. We'll get out guidance about what wearing that looks like, about making sure that mouth and nose are covered, about keeping them on at all times when they are recovered, that type of thing. We'll put together some videos that show what that looks like. How will speech and language work for students on an IEP? Will a child have to wear masks for speech? I think that we've answered that one already, but specific IEP questions can also be directed to the school or to our Director of Student Services. How will specials be taught if that teacher is assigned to teach a cohort? If a specials teacher is teaching a cohort, when the traditional teacher comes into their classroom to teach reading and math, then that cohort teacher can go into the other classroom and work with those students on their specials. So our elementary principals will be developing what that rotation will look like and what that system will look like, but we will utilize those special teachers in that way. How will we have students come into the school at the beginning of the day and leave at the end of the day? We will have smaller numbers of students on the buses than typical. So as buses arrive, students will come into the schools. We will have them come directly to their classrooms rather than typically students would be able to go out, play on the playground, have some open recess time while they're waiting for the school day to start. We will have students come into their classroom right away so that they aren't mingling with other students on the playground. And the same thing at the end of the day. We will stagger our leave time for our classrooms. We'll set up a system so that they leave and they're going to get on their bus. And the only people that they're interacting with are people who are in their cohort, their classroom cohort, and people then, once they get to their bus, people who are on their bus. Do children need a different mask or facial cover for each day? It is recommended that those are washed on a regular basis. We will leave that up to families to make sure that that's taking place, but I think it's valuable to have multiple masks and facial covers, or if you're using the same one, to make sure that that one gets cleaned and washed every evening before being sent back the next day. Was there a mention of staggered start times, lunches, and recess? How will that work, particularly start and end times? As of now, we aren't staggering our starting times or ending times at the schools, but we may have, what we will stagger is at the end of the day, different classrooms getting out at different times. So some of them will get out a little bit earlier, even though the advertised end time for the school is the same time, to be able to get those kids on all those kids on the buses without sending everyone loose at the same time. And the same type of thing at lunch. We will stagger our lunches so that students are staying with their classroom cohort. Question, what does it mean to apply to change from on-site to virtual with the potential that our student would be denied that modification? How can we expect to choose one way or another? I think I've walked through that, but if there's a specific question, I can probably answer that better more in a one-on-one conversation. I'll again quickly go through just in general. That change from on-site to virtual is much, much easier, and it's extremely unlikely that there would be a reason that that wouldn't be allowed. I'm not going to give a blanket statement that it will be allowed in every single case, because I'm not certain that there wouldn't be a case where we might not be able to do that. But in general, that change is much easier than the other change. We would have to be a little bit more strict with changing from virtual to on-site because we have those defined cohorts, and we would want to make sure that there's space to add a student to a cohort at that grade level. What we're asking people to choose right now is what would be their preference right now so that we can begin making those plans. No cubbies or lockers. Does school supplies go back and forth in backpack, or does it stay in their particular desk in their classroom? Outside shoes and gear, where does that go? I would say in general, desks can hold those, and I'm looking at the principals too for a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that, and getting a thumbs up that desks could hold those school supplies. I don't think there would be an expectation that those would have to go home every day with students. That wouldn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Outdoor shoes and gear, we'll find a place for those. There will be a little bit more space, open space in each classroom, because we'll have these smaller groups, so there will be more classroom space where we can store things like outdoor shoes or backpacks and things like that. Will virtual students required to do 2 to 3 hours of learning need to be able to stream using the internet for the entire time? Some rural homeowners have a tough time with internet access, or it's not unlimited. Will some of the learning be offline? I think the 2 to 3 hour guideline is an expectation of mainly online learning. We do have mobile hotspots available for people to check out, and our tech department will be reaching out to families that don't have home internet access or have spotty home internet access. So over the upcoming weeks, we'll be reaching out to you for that. There will be some of the learning that will be offline though too for the virtual. So students a topic might be explained to a student by the teacher virtually, but then an expectation that they will work on that either on their own or with their family offline during their other hours of the day. How will cohorts be assigned based on student academic abilities, or just a mix like a traditional classroom? I think that they will be assigned the way that we would typically assign students. So in that example I used earlier where there's 4 classes at third grade, instead of 3 classes, it would be the same way that we would assign students if there were regularly 4 classes. Will any consideration be taken for students who are new to that school, the ones that have been placed in a new elementary because of the new boundaries? Absolutely. We will be looking for, if they have a buddy from their previous school who are both coming to a new school, I think it would be valuable for us to group them together. We definitely want to be alert to those social and emotional needs of the new students who are coming to a school, as well as the social and emotional needs of all of our students. We've spent a lot of time working on how we can help support students who are new to a school and all of our students as we move forward. I'm looking at the clock, it's about 6:05 right now. We'll go for about 10 more minutes. I'll answer as many questions as we can squeeze in 10 more minutes. And okay. Do you foresee the cohort interacting with one another being kids? I'm going to assume that means inside a cohort, like kids not staying within the 6-foot boundary. And there will be times when students throughout the day are inside 6 feet with someone else, when you're going to sharpen your pencil or moving around your classroom. We know that there's going to be that interaction. One of the things that was reinforced from Rock County Public Health is the need to limit those interactions inside of 6 feet as much as possible. So with the knowledge that there will be those interactions, we want to limit those as much as possible, both within a cohort and limit the interaction between a student that's in one cohort and a student that's in a different cohort. We know that there'll be some time on a bus possibly with students who are in different cohorts, and some time potentially coming across each other throughout the day. But the better job that we do limiting those interactions, the more likely it is that the virus won't be spread. So it will limit illness and also limit the need to quarantine. I see a question that says you should at least check their temperatures, if not before, in the classrooms by the teachers. You cannot guarantee every student will be checked by their parents or caregiver prior to arriving at school. We are going to be in partnership with our families very much, and it's going to be extremely important that every family, before they send their child to school, is going through the screening process and verifying that they have gone through the screening process. If there is a student who looks like they are starting to develop symptoms, or we have reason to believe that they need to be checked, we will have thermometers available in the school, but we also need our staff to be educating our students throughout the day, and the expectation that parents are going to take a child's temperature before they send them to school, I think, is a reasonable expectation for us to have for parents. We really count on all of our parents to be able to reinforce both our policies and help us keep everyone safe. So we want to thank everyone in advance for doing that. For the teachers for virtual, will there be regular education teachers? Yes, they will. Or will they be the specials, art, music, gym teachers? And that's a north side question. I think in general, I'm going to say that the cohort teachers are going to, the virtual teachers are going to be regular education teachers. The number of those that we need and who specifically they will be will depend on the number of requests for virtual that we get. If a student or staff member tests positive, how many days will the cohort need to quarantine? Will the class still meet virtually during quarantine? It is not guaranteed that the entire class would need to quarantine if a student or staff member tests positive. That's tied into what I spoke to earlier. It's only Rock County's guidelines on that are that it's just people who are in that close clinical contact. So if there was physical contact or inside of 6 feet for 15 or minutes or more inside. The length of that quarantine, we're still going to develop. We're waiting for Rock County's guidance to school districts on that they're going to get out by the end of this week. So we'll have that information to you by the middle part of next week. If a family member of a child is exposed, for example, at work, and is tested but awaiting test results, will the student still be allowed to attend in-person cohort? Or if the student family member has exposed, is child required to quarantine until a family member gets result? If someone is tested and is awaiting their tests, we aren't always aware of that. There isn't any mechanism for us to know who that is. We would certainly recommend and hope that if people have been in contact with someone who has been exposed and is awaiting test results, that they stay home. That's part of our screening protocol. One of the questions is, have you been in contact with someone who has been tested or is awaiting test results? So it's part of our screening protocol. Ideally, obviously, those people would stay home. They definitely could take part in the virtual group while they are home. If a student's family member has been exposed or is sick, how will we ensure that the student does not attend and follows the county recommended quarantine? If they are quarantined, the county will notify us that they are quarantined, and then we will be able to ensure that they're not in school. Again, we'll be working in partnership with families on that screening process, or if someone has been exposed, to be honest with us about the fact that they have been exposed. If we know that someone's been exposed, we will not allow that student or staff member to be in school. Could you describe how you envision lunch? Will it be in the classroom with cohorts only? Cohorts will go to lunch together. We're still working out the specific details of how many students will be able to eat lunch at a time. It's going to be dependent on how many are in the school and how many lunch periods we're able to have. We will look to utilize extra space like gymnasium space, spread out around our lunchroom and our classrooms if needed. What I can say right now, no matter how many students we have, is that during lunchtime it would be maintaining our cohort groups as much as possible, and that we would maintain that physical distancing during lunchtime. Are you seriously expecting sick teachers to teach virtually? No, I hope I did not misspeak and say that I would expect sick teachers to teach virtually. Absolutely not. What I did say earlier, or at least intended to say earlier, is that if a teacher is quarantined but is not sick and they are able to teach virtually, then we would look at the possibility of allowing them to do that. But if someone is sick, they would not be working, teaching, or in any other position in the district. Lunch in classrooms, I just talked to. Morning recess, playing before school, I spoke to that earlier. People would go straight to the building. Specialists would be rotating, yes. How can the district say at once that masks are required and at the same time that you'll have mask recesses while 15 kids and a teacher are in the same room? Seems that by definition those concepts are incompatible. 6 feet is negligible when someone sneezes or coughs, especially during a mask recess. I want to clarify that again. There seems to be some misunderstanding on that. Masks will be required. In any situation, and in schools across Rock County and across the state and the country, there are times when people will not be required to wear masks. We will not require someone to put their face covering on when they walk into school and keep it on the entire time until they leave school at the end of the day. In discussions with Rock County Public Health, we've let them know that when people are outside of that 6 foot physical distancing area, that we will allow students to take their masks off. We will still recommend that they stay on as much as possible, but we will allow students to take those off. We would expect part of our protocol is proper hygiene. So if someone sneezes or coughs, we expect them to do that appropriately, and we'll be working with students to teach them that. And I want to reinforce that we are not guaranteeing that there won't be any risks, but we are finding a way to bring students back into school in a way that decreases the risks and allows us to conduct our classes in the best way possible. Is this plan based on all of our teachers returning? If some did not return due to the fact that they have higher risk or have high-risk family members, will that cause problems with the face-to-face model? If we do have staff members who choose to not come back, we would look at replacing those staff members. So we will make sure that we have enough members to be able to operate if we got into a situation where there were outbreaks and we had so many quarantines or people out that we weren't able to staff our schools. Then we would need to move to a different model. That would be something that would move us out of phase 2 or phase 3 and potentially back into phase 1. Could students who ride the bus together be in the same cohort? I don't know that that's a practical model because the students in that grade live spread out across the attendance area for that school. And we would be picking up on the bus students that are in different grades. But we can look at ways to keep that for the students at that grade level, at keeping that as pure as possible. We'll see if there's a way that we can do that. Will face coverings be required during recess, or will they be allowed to have a recess from mass during recess? I think I spoke to that already. Outdoors or times when there's social distancing, students are allowed to take their face coverings off. The majority of 4K through 3 classrooms don't have desks. How will seating students 6 feet apart be handled, or if there are only tables available? The size of our cohorts will be what will fit in that classroom to allow physical distancing. We may need to look at bringing in some different type of smaller desks or tables if needed, but that's something that we'll have to work on once we know the size of those cohorts. Will there be another adult on the bus to monitor the children? If there's one child per bus seat, isn't that closer than 6 feet? Answer the second part of that question first. If students are sitting one child in a seat, we're going to ask them to sit at the windows so that they will be more than 6 feet away from the child who's across the aisle from them. We do realize that if someone is in the seat in front of them, that is less than 6 feet. But we do feel like that's a balance of having the higher backs on the buses, having students facing forward only on the buses, and keeping those smaller groups on the buses will allow us to have a transportation system that's efficient and limits the risk as much as possible. There are a few districts that have talked about having students every other seat, so having an open seat in front of each student. That would require an extremely significant number of bus routes. I don't know that Go Right Way has enough buses or would have enough drivers for us to be able to do that. Will the Right Way buses be used by any other districts? Our buses that we use are specific to our district, so our students wouldn't be getting on and off buses that are used by other districts. And we're working with Go Right Way on a thorough cleaning process in between routes for our buses so that the seats are cleaned in between routes for our buses. Will before and after school care still be offered within the schools by the Ywca and the Ymca? I'm looking to the elementary principals on that question. Yes, for the Ymca and the Ywca. We would expect them to follow guidelines that are at least as strict as our guidelines, and if they put something that's more strict than that in, we will work with them on what their guidelines are for that time. But yes, those will be offered. Yep. We got the next one starting in 13 minutes. I'm going to answer one more question just because I started to read that one. Would 4K have an option for open house or seeing school before first day? Our family's new to the district and concerned about not knowing school before the first day. Jen, would 4K have an option to? Yeah, we'll set something up with families to come in and view the school if they haven't been in the school before. We'll get information out to families on that. I apologize for not getting through all the questions. I know that some of them are repeats. I want to encourage you, if you have additional questions, reach out to your building principals. They'll be able to answer some of the building specific questions, or we will be putting together some question and answer documents with the questions that are still listed here that we didn't get to. We will provide recordings of this on the website within the next couple of days. We'll have that available on the website, so you can look for that if you want to review it, or if you have friends that didn't get a chance to see it. So thank you very much. Continue to work together with us. We really appreciate our partnership with parents, and just want to reinforce that we're looking for ways to return students to our schools in a way that allows us to keep them in the schools, so that we don't come back and immediately have a lot of outbreaks and have to go to fully virtual, but do it in a way that limits the risk as much as possible, and also allows us to continue to provide a high quality education. So thanks again. We appreciate your time, and we will stay in touch. Should I log out of this one then?